Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today at the Mayor's Panel at the Massey College Cities Summit. We have a great panel today with two awesome mayors. The Honorable Mayor Ed Holder, who will be joining us momentarily, and the Honorable Jeff Lehman from Barrie, Ontario. My name is Nigel Jacob. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of Boston, and I run a group there called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, which is our civic R&D lab. Today, we want to talk about cities and innovation, cities and civic innovation, an important topic as a context setting for what are we talking about? Like, what are the parameters for innovation? I think everyone will agree that innovation is a big term. It can mean a lot of different things, and I think we need it to right now. We're facing global catastrophes. Every other day there's a new one, and everyone is expecting. We need to be able to innovate our way out of these challenges. But I think and people are comfortable with the idea of innovation happening in the private sector, right? That's where all of the metaphors come from, all of the ideas. I think people are comfortable with universities and the startup worlds that exist in those spaces. But increasingly, people are looking to cities to innovate, into local government. And so let's start there. Let's talk about the role of cities in innovation. What's your Mayor Lehman, what is your take on cities and innovation in the 21st century?
Well, as urban problems, first of all, thank you so much to Massey College and all the partners for having me here. It's a delight to be speaking with you, Nigel. I'm an admirer of Boston's work, both the Civic dashboard and some of the other innovation that's come out of the city of Boston. I think as urban problems get more complex, the opportunity for cities which have a very unique political role and a very unique community role to see across the silos and create multi-sector approaches to solving complex challenges is really unique. And I think, there are very few other organizations, even with great respect, academia, who have both the mandate and the capacity to see across so many different areas of service delivery, of economic activity, of social activity, and use that breadth to tackle urban challenges. So that's a long way of saying cities can bring together the private sector, the public sector, academia in a way that no others can. And then, by virtue of our unique role in delivering public services, I think we can use those services themselves as vehicles for innovation. And that is everything from drinking water and roads and traffic systems and transportation systems, very much the systems level kind of thinking, to very specific human issues. And as I'm sure Mayor Holder will sympathize, the multiple human challenges that now face our cities and which increasingly end up dominating, for good reason, urban agendas, things such as mental health, addictions, homelessness, housing prices, of course, right now is a huge issue. Those sorts of problems also require that multi-cornered, multi-sector approach. And I think cities are uniquely positioned to do that. The last thing I'll say, and again, this is probably a good moment for Ed to be arriving, is people expect mayors to be able to solve all issues. They expect us to have not the answers, but they believe, and I blame the American system for this to some extent, they believe we have the legislative capacity, the tools, and the responsibility to tackle any and all problems within an urban center. And of course, municipalities as an order of government are not equipped to do that in any way, either by mandate or by fiscal capacity. But we certainly, as mayors and councils and as municipalities, as institutions as a whole, we see it all in our communities and we experience it firsthand. And as a consequence, our role in innovation can and should be to try and bring together often very disparate parts of the community to try and solve those issues. Even if the municipal piece of it is only relatively small, our role as champions and collaboration catalysts is significant.
Mayor Older, good to see you. Thanks for jumping in. As you can see, we have already jumped in, sort of talking about the topic innovation in cities. The question I asked Mayor Lehman was, what do you see the role? The private sector perspective on innovation, I think, is pretty clear in the ecosystem of large companies, small companies, and venture capital and so on. But how do you see the role of mayors in cities in pursuing and driving innovation?
Well, first, I just want to do our volume check here since I didn't do it pre-meeting. Can you hear me fine? Great.
I can, loud and clear.
Well, good morning, and it's great to see my my colleague Jeff Lehman from the great city of Barrie on this call as well. He'll give you particular insights, I'm sure, if he hasn't mentioned that as chair of the Big City Mayors of Ontario, his perch is a very interesting one. As one of the larger cities within that context, and as part of the Big City Mayors of Canada, I have a few perspectives. My first comment in terms of what the role of a mayor should be, I've always ever argued that a leader's role is to lead. But when you're in the mayor's position, it's a very interesting thing. So in my particular city in London, Ontario, there are 15 councillors, 14 councillors and the mayor. Did you know that as mayor, you have one vote out of 15? That's not uncommon in any municipal setting. So your strongest opportunity, both at municipal council, both in terms of staff, and in terms of our broader community, both the business community, our social community, is the ability to influence. It's probably the greatest thing that we have to be able to offer, is that perceived sense of power. And I say that when one is perceived to have power, you have power. But it's the power to influence, I would submit. And that power to influence goes beyond even the city. At one stage, I was in federal politics. I was a federal member of parliament for London, Ontario, and Minister of Science and Technology for the country. And what you learned as a federal minister is that as you were in various communities across this country, you were treated, you were exalted for the 20 minutes you were there, and provided support for their projects. Once you left, you just went back on the plane and where you went. It's different as a mayor. I do believe that while that power is perceived, the influence is real. The strength of the role is absolute. And probably one of the best examples of that is how I deal with senior levels of government. And I know Jeff would feel the same. Our influence in dealing with senior levels of government is more significant. Probably I appreciate the role of municipalities more now as a mayor than when I was a minister. And it makes me understand that if we need to get things done, no municipality can do it alone. In fact, I'd submit to you that it's often said that cities need a seat at the big table, at the intergovernmental tables. But when I consider economic and social recovery, I'd argue I think that's the wrong table. I think that actually the federal and provincial governments need to join mayors at the community table. And I think there's a real difference in emphasis by doing that. One of the things that mayors are expert at is convening communities, because we do it every day. The issues we deal with, the circumstances we deal with, our ability to impact other levels of government, because no municipality can do it alone. We need those supports that come from those different levels of government. And I can tell you from an economic standpoint, we've got some very significant employers coming into our community. London is blessed to have had 10 straight months of positive economic employment. And that's a little different than it's gone the positive way relative to the province and the country. And more times than not, the senior person, the one person they really want to meet, is not the provincial or federal member of parliament to that point, although
Mhm.
they can impact in a positive way. They want to meet the mayor.
Mhm.
Want to know that that their business is appreciated. It's no different than family in a very much way. So we're the head of the family in a paternalistic kind of way. So Papa Jeff over there, in terms of how he deals with his community, and I'm not paternal, but I can tell you from a business and economic standpoint, a social impact standpoint, people look to the mayor and they look for that kind of leadership. Leadership's an interesting word because that's really what you're coming down to. What's the mayor's role? It's leadership, but it's for all the lives we lead, and all the lives we lead are both at the economic and social fronts, at the for the homeless person in our downtown, to the folks who work up at our university and our college, and we've got first-rate facilities in London, Ontario, some of the best education facilities in the country, right here in my city. But but everyone reaches out to you, everyone.
Mhm.
I can't say that was the same as a senior minister, but I can say that actually as a mayor. So I think the greatest connectivity responsibility we have all centers around leadership.
So this question of leadership and power, I think, is really interesting. How do you think about, given, as you say, there are these big corporations coming into cities with lots of jobs, but also with lots of influence, and obviously the mayor's also, as you say, mayor wield a lot of influence and power. How do we make room for, as we think about engaging with the community, with issues of equity in relation to these very powerful people and organizations that are trying to pursue, move the city forward? How do we make that space to make sure that all voices are being heard?
Mm.
Mayor Lehman?
Well, but it's about the intentionality of hearing all voices and not simply accepting that the loudest voices win, or the wealthiest, or the most connected or influential. And I guess what I mean by that, and that's a very general statement. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is the voices that speak loudest in our communities
Mhm.
sort of have a 100x impact, and they shouldn't. They should have a 1x impact. And I
Mhm.
would say that whether I'm talking about Twitter or
Mhm.
I'm talking about lobbying,
Yeah.
traditional government relations activity. I think Ed probably would appreciate the challenge as well, that you hear from such a vocal minority on any issue.
Mhm.
Probably the key intellectual challenge is to remember the need to reach out to much broader voices. So I'll mention something specific to innovation, but I'll give you another example of that issue right now that is
Mhm.
in front of my council. We had an issue recently around the issue of barbecues in parks.
Mhm.
And, amazingly, that became an issue. Now, it became an issue particularly last summer during COVID, because our beaches were very busy. We're a waterfront community. We have a number of beaches.
Mhm.
People were bringing barbecues, and the smoke, and unfortunately, now and again, somebody would toss hot coals in a garbage bin and we'd have a fire.
Yeah.
So our staff wanted to ban them. Well, the problem with that is there's a number of problems with that. Number one, you're wrecking people's fun who just want to
Mhm.
come and barbecue some burgers for a family reunion. But it's such a big part of certain cultures, day at the beach.
Mhm.
In the Korean community, in the Latin community, that barbecue is the center of gravity for a
Mm.
social group. And so it does have disproportionate impacts in terms, but the equity consideration there was something that I started thinking about as well.
Mm.
you know, Public parks are the backyard for people who don't have one.
Mm.
And many of the people who were arguing the barbecue restrictions were the people who lived right beside the beaches and didn't like the smoke, but had an enormous backyard in which they're able to do whatever they choose to do in their backyard. So
Mhm.
there's a sort of equity consideration there. When you take that principle and sort of say, okay, we've got, uh, tens of thousands of people who don't have a backyard who use our public parks as one, you start to think about the policy issue quite differently. You start to
Mhm.
think about it from their point of view. Same goes for economic policy or innovation. And the intentionality I was talking about at the beginning is about bringing entrepreneurs into the mix who might otherwise not even think of working with the city, and bringing entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds, seeking gender and racial equality in your application of those programs. And I think, you know, I could point to a few initiatives that we have underway. I will mention that London, Barrie, Guelph, and the province of Ontario through MARS participated in what was called the Mix Project. And that was very much attempting to bring entrepreneurs who had ideas to solve a problem statement that each of our municipalities put out, and give them the opportunity to test those ideas, do some R&D in collaboration with the city. The equity consideration there is to make sure that in the channels that you are reaching out, we talked about the power of mayors in bringing people together behind projects, that you're not reaching out to the same people. And it's so easy to do. I'm putting together 3 task forces right now to deal with specific issues in my community. And it is so easy when you say, who would we want on those task forces, to go to the same people. You know, I think I have a staff member who's who reminds me that often the best ideas don't come from the sector that are traditionally dealing with the issue. They come from the sector next door, and they're imported into the sector. And there are so many examples of that in technology and entrepreneurship. So anyway, the short answer to the question, I think, is the intentionality of reaching those people in the community who, for either systemic reasons or simple lack of engagement in the past by the municipality, aren't being reached. And you do have to be intentional about that, and you shouldn't apologize for it. Because it can help you reach people with much more diverse viewpoints and diverse ideas.
Thanks so much. That was very rich. There was a lot there. Mayor Holder, do you want to take a crack at this?
Sure. Just a couple of thoughts. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, and I'm not sure that we even really define it as well as we need to. So I think it starts with a clearer definition of terms. I can say that in London, Ontario, a number of our boards and commissions, in fact, I would say most of them have become inward facing, looking at do we truly represent the community? And I'll make a distinction between business boards and community boards. Community boards should always reflect the community. The interesting question is, should business reflect the community? I would submit that it should. In a recent State of the City address, which mayors across the country give via chambers of commerce, and talk about how our cities are, I always used to subtitle mine "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly," because London has tremendous things going for it, and it has challenges like any community would have challenges. So we've been talking about how we make as mainstream Black, Indigenous, people of color, and how you do that as mainstream. You know, it's interesting. Would anyone today in Ontario or Canada consider the Italians other than mainstream, or the Greeks, or the perhaps now even the Portuguese? Because there's been enough time of I'm not sure if I want to call it settlement, adjustment, working together, building trust, doing all of that. The thing in my State of the City that I gave, which was just weeks back, I actually challenged the business community. So I would say that our boards and commissions have done a tremendous job in ensuring that their boards are now starting to reflect our community. But I'm going to take a quote, and what I was looking for here was part of my comments at the State of the City. And I said, when I think of corporate London, the need for change is just as great. To what extent has diversity been fully embraced, especially in senior and middle management? While this type of change takes time, it also takes commitment. And I'll stop there for that point. So before this call, I was sitting with the London Economic Development Corporation, and it's responsible for the attraction of industry to our community, to help people focus on jobs and things you'd imagine an economic development corporation would do. And we just today introduced our diversity and inclusion policy. But then one of the women on our board said, I'd like us to look around. So it wasn't all that long ago, and I'm old enough to remember, that having women on boards was so unique.
Mm-hmm.
But this woman said to us, I'd like us to look around this board. And she's very honest. And she said, do we truly reflect our community? And the answer is no. And it isn't because there aren't incredibly talented people of non-white, I'll now say non-female too, I mean, because again, that's, while that's still an issue, it's certainly becoming less an issue in terms of having strong, talented females on boards and commissions. But are you taking care of your senior, middle and senior levels of management? Because that becomes your succession plan. If you're not doing that, then you're talking nonsense. You don't really mean what you say. And I think the opportunity we have, when I look at our corporations, I look at our university and college, I look at our own city hall. Are we representative of our community? And so it's one thing because kind of the cute thing now seems to be to have a diversity and inclusion policy. And I'm not trivializing, I'm just simply saying that it's the thing to do.
Right.
But there's a lot of tokenism.
Yeah, but where do you take it from there becomes the question, isn't it, Jeff? Where do you take it from there so that in fact you walk that talk?
Where do you take it from there? How do you sort of get deeper into that? Marilyn, you have a thought?
Sure. So I think you do need to start with a systemic viewpoint. I mean, if you don't accept that there are systemic factors, and this is one of the really interesting challenges around anti-racism initiatives. There's a whole dialogue out there that does not distinguish the fact that you can participate in a system that is systemically racist or has racist outcomes without being overtly or even subtly personally racist. I mean, the system is the problem. And, you ask yourself, why do we have overrepresentation of certain racial groups or underrepresentation of women in certain systems or organizations? So you take that approach and say, if it's a systemic issue, then you need actually substantial change. And there is of course, the cultural and the attitude element, the personal understanding that needs to come. But you start, I think, with policy, and that's a really boring answer. But I'll give you a good example. Human resources, even hiring policies and procedures, something as simple as taking names off resumes, which can be a source of bias, is actually very significant, because what you are doing is accepting that those very difficult to address sort of subtle biases or systemic biases can be addressed through procedure or policy. So it's a boring response, but I actually think when you start with, if you're trying to address systemic issues, you need to have a systemic response, and that includes policy. Then there's the whole communication piece of that. And I guess what I would say on that right now is it does require champions, and it requires people to have difficult conversations. And we're Canadian, so we avoid difficult conversations as a cultural phenomenon. And I think that's changing. And the key when that changes is to create the safety to have conflicting viewpoints in a conversation. Because the other thing I guess I would say about that right now is there is such intense negativity in the discussion. No, not negativity. There's not a lot of listening in discussions around these issues. There's a lot of screaming and there's a lot of echo chamber. And what we need is genuine dialogue.
I'd like to, can I just add to that? There, you ask, how do we get there? And I think it's one word: accountability. Our London police have a slogan in Latin on their door side, and it says "Deeds, not words." And then you know what they did? Now it's in Arabic. Now it's in Spanish. Now it's in Mandarin. What they have done is they've gone beyond because they believe that that is so critically important. One of the things that our city has done recently, and I think this is more of a recent phenomenon, certainly in our city, but we have now council approved senior staff members. One is will be a race relations officer. One is a diversion and inclusivity officer, and these people will be reporting directly to the city manager, no filters. And with the idea that everything that we do, we've got several pillars of principle that we use in terms of our strategic plan as a city. And one of them, for example, is that we must, with every policy that we do, we must consider it through the lens of the impact on women and girls. Our language, our actions, and it really has changed some of the focus of our policy because it's compelled us to do that. And we're a highly sensitive community that, look, I think every community wants to do the right thing, but if there's no sense of check back, no sense of accountability in terms of talking the talk, then I think that becomes a challenge.
Because that's the tokenism. Agreed. Yeah.
So what we do is, I mean, like all cities, we have to grapple with so many huge challenges. And I would say to you, when we look at how we, my Cape Breton mom would always say something pretty basic. She'd say, a caring community is measured by how well we care for those who are less able to care for themselves. But also, and I think this is key too, that we have an obligation, an absolute obligation to do more, to do better. And so when it kind of comes back to that prior question about the role of a mayor, and I think, and I think that's why selecting the mayor is actually such a critically important part, because I'll be candid, I probably did not appreciate the kind of role of influence that I would have in this community. But you set the moral tone, you set the whole sense of how the facility, the operation, and your broader community should be considered, because we are up against issues that happen every day. Look, everything that we are doing is doing through the lens of COVID now. I mean, how was life before the pandemic? I can hardly remember. I don't even know if I'm going to be a very good mayor post-pandemic, because all I've done for the last 18 months, it seems, is live and act as a mayor, as the pandemic mayor, which is the greatest challenge, I think, from a whole physiological and health perspective. But our job, even through all of that, is to hold our people together. So at the very early stages, when we had a huge Black Lives Matter protest in the city, and I didn't go. And you know why I didn't go? Because for about 2 months before, I was preaching, please do not congregate in crowds.
Right.
We had 10,000 people in Victoria Park. I understand exactly why they needed to be there. And I supported the spirit of what they were trying to accomplish, and it was safe. And people, even with 10,000 people in our downtown park, they organized it phenomenally well. All to say that I think that the mayor becomes absolutely the moral compass of the community that he or she represents. That, probably more than anything, is our role.
Yeah. We've uncovered a ton of stuff. You've made some excellent points.
Are we even on the agenda yet? I'm trying to think.
Yeah, the agenda is long behind us. I do want to take off on some of the more recent things that you both mentioned one way or another. I just like to get your take on how, like, when I think of the last year, it's not just, as you were saying, Mayor, it's not just about COVID-19. It's also about the racial reckoning that's happening increasingly across the world, but certainly in North America. I'd just love to get your take on how those two dimensions, COVID-19 and racial equity, however you want to phrase that in your context, how that has changed the job of being mayor.
Well, let me add a few things, because I think we are seeing the intersection of a number of simultaneous fissures, and they're layered, right? I mean, you've got questions of racial equality. We have questions of income equality and inequality, and in my community, with extremely high cost of living when it comes to rent. Believe it or not, City Barrie's got the 4th highest rent in the country. And those are from a couple of apps that track this, PadMapper and Zoocasa, but also CMHC, the Canadian government statistics. The intersection of these issues actually is very relevant within the pandemic, because what the pandemic has done is exposed and heightened the impact of issues such as the prevalence of racialized workers within essential services. And this is playing out as we speak. With the response and the very welcome changes that were made yesterday by Ontario in terms of the targeting strategy for vaccinations. So how has it changed the job of mayor, though? I mean, I will admit to struggling to deal with multiple crises at once at times during the pandemic. I mean, as we've been talking about, you've got the key message of communicating the need for a collective response to a pandemic. And that's overriding everything, right? Because it's a state of emergency. The ramifications of failure are very severe. Hospitals being overwhelmed, and the potential for greater loss of life. That has taken precedent. But not for a moment can you ignore, or should you ignore, or even allow to take a back seat the immediacy of the housing crisis, the opioid crisis, which we haven't talked about. That one, the poison drug crisis, is taking taking more lives than COVID in my city. And then the underlying, and I think root cause issues, which relate to income equality and relate to housing and service delivery. So something that I've been very passionate about, getting back to the core of this panel, the innovation agenda, is that, done right, we should be treating the root causes of these issues and not reacting to them. However, during a pandemic, a state of an emergency, I feel like I've been in reactive mode now for over a year. I hate being there. It is not the way the job should be done. Any leader who has the ability to pull communities together, as Ed calls it, or to bring great people together behind great projects, which is my line on many of these things. We haven't. It sounds like a dodge, but it's true. We have not had time to do that, either mentally or practically, because we've had to be reactive. To that end, I'm now trying to pursue, whenever you get super busy, you got to delegate. And one of the things I think we have started to do now better this spring is to start to engage the community in tackling some of the root cause issues of these intersecting problems. And I think the most interesting work that's being done in my community right now on these issues are by bodies or groups, sometimes facilitated by the city, sometimes entirely separate from us. Some who are facilitated by my college, Georgian College, who are a tremendous organization, who are saying, how can we actually take what we're learning from the pandemic, what the pandemic has exposed in many cases, and turn it into sustainable solutions. And my quick example of that, before I give the floor back to my honorable colleague, is housing. The pandemic immediately forced us to close homeless shelters and move people into hotels. And that's something that happened everywhere because they couldn't be in a congregate setting. It was far too dangerous. So our providers, our homeless shelter providers, rented most of a 3-story hotel and have housed people. And lo and behold, not just because COVID has damaged the tourism industry so strongly, hotels are emerging as a great opportunity to buy and convert to permanent supportive housing. So how can we take what is an emergency response and make it a permanent and huge impact in the fight against homelessness? Because we know the root causes of homelessness in so many cases are related to mental health, and supportive housing wrapping people with the services they need to help them with the reasons they're homeless. That's the solution, or the best solution that we've got at the moment to chronic homelessness. So I'm really committed now in the late months of this pandemic, notwithstanding we're in many ways the most difficult month of the whole thing, to trying to take some of these approaches, which we discovered we could do overnight. Look at that. We had an emergency. All of a sudden, we could do this stuff overnight.
All the stuff we said we couldn't do, we just did it.
All this. Well, and you know why? Because there was a reason. There was the risk aversion that makes things take months suddenly was trumped by the emergency. Was overruled by the exigencies of an emergency situation. If we could act with the kind of willingness to innovate and experiment and the energy that we have demonstrated in the pandemic in normal times, we would innovate and accomplish things so much faster in government. So nothing, I'm a glass half full guy, and I tend to see that one of the good things that may come out of COVID for my level of government is some degree of understanding that we can move faster and we can take a few more risks in trying to accomplish long-term solutions.
That was awesome. Mayor Holder, I know you've got thoughts. I see
Yeah.
you bouncing in your chair there.
Well, my glass is full, actually, to put that in perspective. Your question is a good one in terms of how you put focus. You don't balance, but how you put focus on the critical issues, with COVID being the backdrop of every aspect of our communities relative to communities most impacted. You know, it's interesting, COVID's had a disproportionate impact on minorities in our community. In fact, by our health units calculations, twice the impact of non-minorities in our communities. And I think that comes back to some of the issues tied in around poverty and the challenges associated with that. So when Jeff talks about the reactive role, I guess if there's one advantage to a reactive role, as long as you're reasonably logical and you've got good people around you, you can take the steps necessary to deal with the now. So while we're dealing with the now, one of the challenges as a mayor that you have to do is you have to say, okay, we will get through this. There will be an end. So how do we get there? And how do we assist Londoners in need, which I would say all Londoners are in need, but some to greater degrees, of course. So one of the things that we started with was that I called on our community to help me. And as I created the mayor's task force on social impact and recovery, and I created the mayor's task force on economic impact and recovery. And we had hundreds of groups and individuals who shared their candid thoughts over a period of many weeks. We took some of these directly to senior levels of government. Some of these things weren't a money thing. They were directional. They were help us put some structure and framework around next steps. And we were able to do that. But then it was clear that that COVID, this pandemic, is not going away quickly. We realized that some time ago. So those two task forces morphed into the London Community Recovery Network. And again, we asked the community, both at the business and community level, to come together to give us really constructive ideas as to, if we imagine that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but I would tell you many people couldn't even see the tunnel. What are the things that we need to do to work through this? And we got some really, truly constructive ideas, which we've taken back to council in its first, in some of what I'll call the low-hanging stuff to be able to do to help with the recovery of our city. And now in front of council will be the next part of it, because we see this as a 2, 3, and 4 year project working through it. I would add to that when I make the comment about the impact that COVID has had, particularly on our most vulnerable. I would say to you that homelessness seems to be one of the big foundations. We can talk about addictions and mental health, and those are absolutely all part of that that monstrous challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But homelessness becomes a foundation. So we made a resolve, and we are the first city in Canada to eliminate veterans homelessness. In other words, to put it to functional zero. And by the way, that doesn't mean you're not going to find a veteran who isn't homeless, but we have commitments that it's short term and we get them permanent, permanent residence. But my comment at the time, again, coming back to our state of the city, is I said, if we can do that for veterans, and the federal government acknowledged London as being the first community to successfully deal with veterans homelessness, I said, why can't we do it for Indigenous? London has the third largest homeless Indigenous population in our province. It's massive. And if we can do it for Indigenous, can we also do it? What about women and children in distress? And if we can consider all of those important facets of our community, can we do it for the chronic homeless? And to get to functional zero. So I put out what I affectionately call the big idea, but it's to create 3,000 units to be built in the next 5 years to deal with chronic homelessness. And it's about to be approved formally by council. Our staff have bought in, our industry has bought in, our community groups have bought in, and that's the goal. That's one of the foundational pieces that I think we can do. And coming back to your original comment about how you balance the challenge of COVID on our minority groups, you have to always, in every conversation that you have with your health unit, with our city, and with our social community partners, that has to be paramount, because it's the world they live in, much more than the world I live in, but I live in it vicariously through the organizations that help support them. But it's a huge challenge that I don't think an hour in a phone call is going to resolve.
Right. That was very rich. Thank you. I will ask one more question before we move to questions and answers. I think they're starting to roll in. I think both of you, in one way or another, have talked about not just mayors in the role of mayors in driving innovation, but more broadly, like the role of local government as well, right? As an extension of what the mayor does. Whether it's, what Mayor Lehman was talking about, collaborating with entrepreneurs or with universities or what have you. But why don't, I feel like, especially now, there's an expectation that government also needs to be innovating, just like all these other sectors. Why don't we see more of that? Like, there's lots of reasons, presumably, but what are the disabling factors or the bumps in having more innovation from local government?
So I'll point to two things. First is fiscal capacity, and second is cultural, by which I mean our corporate culture, and often which is an issue across our sector, or has been traditionally. So fiscal capacity, it's an obvious a problem. We generally do not fund or have capacity to fund pilot programs at modest cost. We're so focused on delivering core services and stretched financially to do so that anything that is of significant cost that's an expansion of a service area or a new model faces challenges. Now that I think often, and getting to my second issue, that can be a bit of an excuse, because just not all innovation is expensive. In fact, many of the best innovations end up with a very positive ROI. Some of them require upfront capital, and that's often one of the challenges. So this is an issue that I'm really interested in, because, let's go to supportive housing. Supportive housing can reduce calls for emergency service. It can reduce hospital admissions. It can reduce pressure on the primary healthcare system. It can reduce pressure on the justice system. It has an incredible ROI if you look across government. But the ability of municipalities to say, okay, there's 8 different budgets there: a hospital, a police service, a fire service, an ambulance service, the justice system, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of the Solicitor General. All of those buckets are going to save something
Mhm.
if we just properly house and support some of the people who are constantly interacting with those systems, the ROI is a no-brainer, but
Mhm.
try and get 8 different organizations to give up some of their budget, especially when all of them are stretched. So that problem, philanthropic capital, Mars is really interested in assisting with this problem. Philanthropic capital through foundations is very interested in assisting with this problem. And in some cases, it can be outcome-based financing. Social impact bonds were thought to be one of the ways to do this.
Mhm.
They've proved to be problematic. But this is still a financial problem in need of a solution. And the related cultural piece, corporate culture piece, municipalities are risk averse because we do have established services that in many cases have legislation that is itself risk averse. One thinks of drinking water. People in the municipal sector in Canada are very, very averse to experimentation within the drinking water system. And, because as soon as you start to talk about involving in any way collaboration with the private sector, there are very legitimate, in some cases, concerns around mixing the profit motive with something like drinking water. Of
Mhm.
course there are, but that shouldn't stop innovation in the sector. So how can we use industry associations and academia to drive innovation within those service sectors? It's my view that because we don't really reward innovation,
Mhm. Interesting.
we don't get it. We don't reward it financially because that's not the way compensation works in the sector. And we don't return, and that's, I think that's an interesting question. But the broader issue to me is why don't we have a culture that rewards innovation? And something I talk about internally is the license to potentially fail. Are we in somebody's performance review or the discussion of a department's performance going to praise a failed experiment because at least that department tried to experiment versus others that don't? No, we do not have that culture. We have the opposite. A failed program, policy, or project is seen as a disaster, not an attempt to improve. And that is a culture of entrenched service delivery models that I think does need to be challenged.
It's interesting in the private sector, failure is often trumpeted. We talked about, if you go to Silicon Valley, you often hear people talking about, how many, companies they've started, startups
Yeah,
that they've tried and failed, but we don't have a way of doing that in the public sector.
correct.
Mayor Holder, do you have thoughts on this?
I have a Cape Breton mother. I have many thoughts. So, tell you about the private sector. I'm just about to peel a label off here because in a world where I can't afford props, I'll take them where I can get them. We all know what these are. Remember those Post-it notes? That was a failure. That was a mistake. That was someone from 3M who was trying to create a stronger adhesive and found that it wouldn't stick, and created the Post-it note. By the way, 3M Canada, location, London, Ontario. Proud of that. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective than Jeff on this. Whether you're a city, whether you're a business, you have no choice but to be progressive, to be innovative. Listen, I'm, as the old guy in this room, I remember black and white TVs coming on board. I mean, that's how far back Bonanza and Gunsmoke come to me. But I would tell you that where Jeff's right about the challenge of municipalities is our fiscal challenge. But I would tell you that in areas that we can become collaborative with private industry, and I think this is one of the things that I see cities doing, becoming more collaborative with the technology created by industry. Issues around climate change. It's one thing that my city council has determined that this is an absolutely critical piece. And the work that we do with Western in terms of our university here in London centers around climate change, and the innovation that is coming through that collaboration is pretty unique. How we're dealing with our waste management, for example, that's innovation. And so the reason I brought up the old to bring us to the current is that when you imagine all the innovation that has occurred, when you can talk to somebody through your wristwatch and do those kinds of things, that gives you the state of technology where it is. So I'm absolutely confident that for cities to be able to afford to provide the services that they need to do for individuals, part of that comes with that collaboration with industry. So I see this as a positive opportunity for collaboration for us as a city. So and I think our economic recovery is going to be a great example of that as well. So what's a city's role? I think a city's role sets the goalposts and the guideposts, and you create an environment that allows those either within your structure and those around you to be able to prosper. And to the extent that they prosper and are creative, we benefit from that in general, but also in specific. Because what's the challenge we try to give our staff? Do more and watch our tax dollar. And by the way, it's going to be particularly poignant as we go into an election year now at municipalities. How are we going to be handling that? And I can tell you, even in London, we're looking at a slight increase in our 4-year multi-year budget. It will be the largest of the 4. And so to the extent that we can find economies where we can to take the pressure off our citizens for good reason, you need to have the support of industry. So I don't see it as a city-only process. I see the city engaging with the broader community to make you more cost-effective, to make you clever at what you do, or at least certainly to appear to be that. But I look at that as absolutely a collaboration.
So we've had a few questions about return on investment of innovation. How do we think about ROI on innovation in the public sector? Mayor Lehman, do you want to address that?
ROI is obviously not so much financial as the impact, and there's the key term is. The previous CAO of the city of Barrie, one of the things that I really believed in that we continue to try and take forward is our KPIs as a municipality, our key performance indicators, should be demonstrated outcomes, and they should be impact and not volume. And so the key measure of return on investment, ROI, yes, it may have a fiscal benefit, and ideally, innovations will bring those kinds of fiscal benefits for municipalities. But that's not what our job is. Our job is to make a difference for our residents in delivering public services and do it wisely with tax dollars. So whether it has a 1% ROI or a 10% isn't the key factor. It's does it have an impact, and does it do what we seek to do? So often in the municipal sector, we measure how much of something we do. We maintained another 500 kilometers of roads this year, or we built another 25 units of affordable housing. The problem is, did it work?
Right.
Did we do a good job of it? Or in fact, are we getting worse every year at either snow plowing or, the health outcomes for our marginalized population? What are those health indicators? Are their lives getting worse, even though we've got more roofs over their heads? Are we losing more people to underlying causes? So building and measuring impact, I think, is the key to defining the sort of return on investment for innovation. And impact metrics is a whole nother discussion that is a really interesting discussion, because across the municipal sector, we are guilty of measuring how much we do something, not whether what we do matters and has an impact.
And presumably that's another opportunity for collaboration with universities and researchers
It would be
generating
a
those
tremendous,
highlights.
yeah, that would be really helpful.
Mayor Holder, sorry.
Ed.
Yep.
You know, it's interesting. If you imagine, I come from a business background, and I had partners in a medium-sized company. We were shareholders in this business, and we were very motivated by shareholder return, the value of our shares, and that from a corporate standpoint. And by the way, when you're a smaller business, you're just saying, you know, do I have enough money in the bank to pay my bills, and can I get at the end of the day something that's left in the account to take home? All challenged, by the way, as we know too well, by COVID. The return on investment, the ROI in a municipality, is not measured that way. It's measured by what we do. I mean, I can tell you that London, Ontario, has had 45 consecutive years of AAA finance rating by Moody's. And by the way, I can say that, and it happens to be true. We may be the only municipality in the country that can say that. And so you know how that matters, from how we and that drives a lot of what we're able to do. When COVID first hit in a dramatic way in 2020, you know, the issue for all of us as municipalities: are we going to be able to pay our bills? What supports are we going to get from senior levels of government to help us through it? We didn't know, but at least we had reserves in various areas that helped us weather that. Transit being one of the monster, and I mean monster, issues for every municipality across the country.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that we were able to withstand it in the short term, and then when we did receive the great support from the province and the federal government for 2020, and now in Ontario 2021, and kudos to my own minister Jeff Urick and the Conservative provincial government, because what they have done is they have given Ontario municipalities some assurance in 20 and 21. But having said it, we had the reserves to support us, to be able to help. But you know how people look at ROI, I think in my city, they look at what are the tax levels that we pay to provide the services that we do? How many homeless do we have on the street? My shareholders are the citizens of London, and I've got 14 partners in 14 backyards there, and I call those counselors. And those 14 backyards work with me so that we can provide a balanced, thoughtful, managed approach. But I really want to come back to the principal point. Cities, we set the goalposts. But we shouldn't be the ones that are trying to control everyone's lives in this process. I think that's an absolute mistake. But the fact that we can provide, come back to that very first comment I made about leadership some time ago today. I think that's what we provide as a municipality. So I have had people say that I am the worst mayor they've ever had. I've had I'm the best mayor they've ever had, and many don't offer an opinion. But it all depends on how it impacts them directly, is how I see that. So because I think mayors have compassion in how they try to deliver the services that are necessary, but it's not us doing it. We've got a tremendous staff that make it work. And I've got 14 partners in this in council that help me try to guide us through this, what I'll say probably the most challenging time that anyone could have imagined. I'm sure Jeff didn't know we were going into a pandemic when he got reelected, but I certainly had no idea.
I just wanted to mention that it just turned 10 o'clock, so I think at any second we're going to get booted out. So I just want to extend thank you to the two of you. This was an amazing conversation. I wasn't expecting Thursday to start on such a high note, but thank you so much for your insightful commentary and very willing to publicly lay it all out there.
Well, thank you as well, Nigel. You've been great and thoughtful. Appreciate it.
I guess we're still here, so we might as well take up the space. I mean, we've covered a lot of territory. Any sort of parting thoughts that you would like to make, Mayor Lehman, as we round out this last minute or so?
Sure. I mean, and I think it's a time that we need to focus on what comes after COVID and have some hope. And it's interesting, Ed and I and the Ontario big city mayors had a meeting last night. We were talking about this issue a little bit. My genuine hope for after COVID, and we talked about this a little bit just now, is that we are able to sustain some of the energy with which we have, at least initially, we were able to pivot our service models and encourage innovation and sustain that after COVID. I also hope we're able to sustain the focus on some of the issues that COVID has laid bare. And I mean, this goes for social issues, but and something we haven't really talked about is economic issues. The fragility of small businesses, how our Main Street vitality depends so strongly on the food and drink sector, and how we've probably taken that for granted because you know those business models were able to be successful without us really doing too much for them until some storm clouds hit. And I think, you know, challenges around business financing, small business financing, and credit and insurance, and those sort of pedestrian issues, pardon the pun, that affect a Main Street business are really relevant because, you know, there's polarization even in the business community, and COVID, I think, has exposed how for many small businesses, they are pushed further into very difficult financial circumstances. And there's a lot more resourcing for corporate models that that are pulling apart some of the customer base. So anyway, the short version is I hope we're able to sustain what we've learned and sustain some of the energy for collective action. And that is something that Canadians are capable of doing incredibly well. It's been mythologized a bit through our history, but I actually do believe it's in our DNA. And back to Ed's point and my point in our first opening statements, that if there's a unique role for mayors, it's in pulling people together to collaborate it on a community level. And he's very right, very much right. We need the federal and provincial governments to come and arrive in communities and participate at the community tables. And that's something that has occurred during COVID. We have seen those community level issues suddenly become the focus of provincial and federal governments, whether it's business supports, social supports, housing, and otherwise. Look at the rapid housing initiative that the federal government rolled out and are now struggling to deliver because it turned out to be such a good idea that it's oversubscribed. So I think that's what I want to see post COVID, and I think our roles as mayors can be to try and sustain some of that collective energy.
That was awesome, Mayor Holder.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. At his articulate best, said so many things that are totally correct, and it's a privilege to be associated with him. He's really good at what he does. You know, it's interesting. Everything is measured, as we said earlier, in terms of COVID. I think the issue of how soon we receive the vaccinations across the country and in all of our communities is the game changer for us, so that we can try to find out what our new normal is, as much as we'd like to go back to the old normal. I'm not even sure we know what it looks like, because, again, to echo Jeff's comments, we don't know who's going to survive all this. We hope and expect that most will, but it's been tough out there. It's tough for individuals who are trying to pay their rents and make their mortgage payments, raise their kids. It's tough for businesses that are just hanging on. It's tough for employees who are just trying to do their very best to get by. And so we feel that as mayors. Oh my God, they say, what keeps you up at night, or what's the first thing you think about in the morning, is what's happening in our community today. And, you know, if you could put a finger in every dike hole, and if you could somehow anticipate it all, which you can. I mean, first thing I do is I look for our COVID case counts. over, it's the first thing I
Me
look for
too.
every morning. Are we a little ahead or a little behind? And my mood tends to sometimes reflect that as well.
Hmm.
We had such a strong economy in London, Ontario, and it was growing so quickly. And I think that will actually help us set the foundations for going forward.
Mm-hmm.
But there will be some winners and losers through COVID, because some businesses have done exceptionally well as a result, and some will survive. But when I say businesses, I'm talking about the people that work within them. That's because it's about the people, and I think that any good mayor recognizes that this is all, it truly is about the people, because that's who we're elected to serve. And where you try to strike your balance is when we didn't get into the philosophical thing about what happens when you're when you have a principled view of how things should be, contrary to a number of citizens. Where do you go with that? And that could be a discussion for another time. But listen, I look forward to going back to the oldest baseball park in North America, which happens to be in London, Ontario, Labatt Park. And
That park is the oldest? That's cool. I didn't know that.
Even
You're
Guinness
from
Book-
Boston. You know something about old ballparks, right,
I
Fenway?
do. I know old rickety ballparks.
Yeah.
Well, listen, you come down to London, Ontario, and when the season is allowed to be open again, we'll treat you to a ballpark, Frank, and some Cracker Jacks.
Will do. My mom is already counting the days until I can come visit her in London. So I'll drop in and see you when I'm there next.
Well, be loud and proud. I'll look forward to seeing you.
Thank you so much. You were both brilliant. It was a great conversation, and I know how busy you are. So have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Thanks, Ed.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.